The current Chief Marketing Officer approach to customer experience risks negatively impacting growth. Homogenised experiences and table stakes technology have created a sea of digital sameness that threatens the CMO's go-to strategy for growth. That is, improving the customer experience. In fact, the CMO's go-to playbook for growth has run its course. Customer experiences are stagnant. Digital sameness has taken hold. Tech spend is skyrocketing, and cost reductions have cut marketing to the quick. So where should CMOs turn to grow their brands? Hello everyone, and welcome. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Paul Head, and I'm CEO of the Comms Council. And of course, you would expect me to argue as I just have. But that introductory statement wasn't mine. It comes from a report by Forrester Research released in late June that finds that investing in creativity will help firms achieve higher returns over the long term. Entitled "The Cost of Losing Creativity," the report argues that it's time to differentiate using agency creativity and move on from homogenised, tech-led brand experiences. They've become table stakes and no more. But whether or not you agree with the report's specific findings, and I actually do commend you to have a look at it because it's worth a look, so form your own view. What you can't do is disagree that it forms part of a rapidly growing body of evidence supporting the case for sustainable differentiation via creativity and long-term brand building. Which is why we're here today. The Comms Council first started working with Peter Field some 6 or 7 years ago from memory, Peter. Over that period, he's been to New Zealand, I had a number of times, but I believe it's 5, working with agencies and advertisers on the drivers of effectiveness. About 18 months ago, over a bite of dinner at a very nice little French bistro in Chelsea, thank you, we came up with the idea of a New Zealand-specific book that makes the case for long-term brand building, using the work that Peter and others have done over a decade or more. That turned into this book, Why Aren't We Doing This? We launched that late last year, and we've distributed nearly 2,000 copies of it since then to agencies, advertisers, and the New Zealand governance community. It's unique to New Zealand, but interestingly, it's gained international attention, with requests for copies from across Asia and North America, including the global head office of General Motors. So the thinking is obviously gaining traction, and the fact that what we've done here is turn it into something that's digestible is resonating with clients locally and starting to resonate globally. Opportunity for you, Peter. Take the book global. Hopefully, some of you are using the evidence in the book to ask the question of your organisation, why aren't we doing this? Or even better, some of you are being challenged by your CEO and board chair about why aren't we doing this? If you don't have a copy, it's available to download free on the Comms Council website. So today we've brought Peter back to share the latest learnings, evidence and case studies since the book was published. We operate in a dynamic environment, and it's important to stay on top of the latest thinking as the evidence evolves. But before I start, I have to do some health and safety. In the event of an emergency, please proceed to the assembly area, which is outside the neighbouring Huawei building at 120 Albert Street, which is down the stairs, out the front, and I think to the right. That's it for the housekeeping. At the end, we'll have some questions for Peter. We should have plenty of time to do that. So, to Peter himself. Peter spent 15 years as a strategic planner in advertising and has been a marketing consultant for the past 22 years. Effectiveness case studies analysis underpins much of his work, which includes a number of important marketing and advertising texts, including Marketing in the Era of Accountability, The Long and the Short of It, Media in Focus, Brand Immortality, The Link Between Creativity and Effectiveness, Selling Creativity Short, Why Aren't We Doing This?, and chapters in Eat Your Greens and the Sage Handbook of Advertising. His latest work in partnership with Les Binet, Effectiveness in Context, was published in October last year. He was also a contributor to the Wharton Future of Advertising project. Peter writes and speaks regularly around the world about marketing effectiveness. He's an honorary fellow of the UK Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. So please join me in a warm welcome for Peter.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming. What an amazing audience. What can I say? Huge audience. Lovely. So I'm going to be talking, I'm not just going to do a reprise of the book. Hopefully some of you will have read it, but I'm actually going to try and update it as we go along with some new evidence and some new findings, particularly with some of the material from Effectiveness in Context, which is about the nuances of how we need to flex the rules depending on the kind of situation that we're marketing in. So there are two parts to my presentation. Firstly, the first part of my presentation, I want to put the case for brand building. And this may seem a strange thing to have to do, but the last 10 years particularly have seen an enormous global assault on brand marketing, on indeed the whole basis of a brand. And I think we really have to push back against this. There is a growing momentum now, particularly in the US, I'm happy to say, of marketers who realize that you walk away from the brand and brand marketing at your peril. But it's been happening on an enormous scale around the world. So I want to rebuild the case for brands and for brand marketing. And when I've done that, I'll spend the last half of the presentation talking a bit about the best practice guidelines. How do we do it? What can we piece together from the world of effectiveness case studies to learn how to do this better and with more certainty? That's the book. You've already seen it. I won't plug it again. But it's free. So hell, price elasticity. It should have infinite demand. As I've said, the data that we're drawing on here, I'm not just going to draw on IPA data, but that is the bulk of it. I'm going to pull in findings from other authors and other thinkers around the world as well. But the data I'm using is drawn from these reports, particularly the most recent one, Effectiveness in Context. And what we're dealing with here is the confidential data submitted alongside entries to the UK's version of the EFIs, that is the IPA Effectiveness Awards. And anyone who submits in a case study an entry to the competition there is obliged to fill in a truly gruesome questionnaire which captures all sorts of data about the brand and the campaign. We now have, in fact, it's more than 550, where we're looking at the most recent data from 2018. We're now up to about 600 digital era case studies that we can mine. And very simply, what we're able to do is to examine how inputs, such as strategic or media or creative choices, influence outcomes in the sense of hard business effectiveness, the usual kind of metrics, market share growth, profit growth, and so on and so forth. And that's what we're doing here. And we can look at that over different time scales, and that's going to be a really, really important lens for me. Because, as many of you will know from previous presentations I've given, or indeed from this book if you've read it, is that we cannot generalize about effectiveness. What works best in the short term is very, very different from what works best in the long term. And one of the big problems we face in marketing today is that we have been, for one reason or another, seduced by short-termism or forced into short-termism. And when you do that, the kinds of strategies and metrics and media choices that you make become completely transformed. Transformed for short-term effect, but not for long-term. So let me just start then by reminding you of the two different ways marketing works, the two timescales over which marketing can work, and why it is so important that we don't generalize about the short and the long term. So in the short term, we have what I will call sales activation. These are behavioral nudges that make us do something now. Now, often they are, kind of price deals and offers like this German retailer Aldi. Increasingly, these may be served digitally, of course, so that is a good old-fashioned print ad. Or they might be some kind of geo-targeted message. Again, this happens to be a good old-fashioned outdoor site outside a Walmart supermarket in the UK, but again, these are often increasingly served digitally. Or they could just be a McDonald's reminder to remind you you're hungry. Or on a more creative level, perhaps the Skittles promotion around pride marches around the world where they gave up their logo. Or, of course, the hugely celebrated Scary Clown Night idea for Burger King that ran around the world. But we have to remember that that was a Halloween night promotion involving giving away free burgers at its core. So these are behavioral nudges that get us to do something now. They are not about brand building. They may have some transient effects on brand building, on brands, but they are either not in market long enough to make a lasting impression, or they are simply not memorable enough to do so, and price-based marketing is typical of that. So these can have very powerful short-term effects. If it's a great deal, a great offer, a great promotion, or a powerful behavioral nudge, a nice piece of information, we will respond to that. But because of its very nature, it doesn't last, it doesn't endure, and the effect moves on. That is where long-term brand building comes in. It's a totally different model, totally different way of thinking. So this is about creating associations with our brands. And most powerfully, these are always emotional associations that prime us to want to choose that brand long, long ahead of the moment of decision. So activation happens at the moment of decision. If you're not going to remember something, you need to serve these messages at the moment of decision. Brand building works in the long term. It reinforces over time, so we have to serve these messages well in advance, and they have to be very memorable. And whether it's the global Snickers campaign, the fantastic Dove work that's been done, the campaign for real beauty over many years now, the immensely powerful piece of online video that Unilever ran for their Lifebuoy soap brand, and that remains to me in the bottom right-hand corner the most powerful piece of online video I've ever seen. And if anyone ever tells you that online video cannot be more than 3 seconds long, you can tell them that they're talking BS. Go and watch that video. It's amazing. And I'm going to come back and talk a little about the Clorox experience in the US, which again just shows you what a transition from a short-term product feature kind of way of working to an emotional brand building approach, what that can do for a campaign and for a business. So there are different models. One of them works in the long term, one of them works in the short term, and we have to remember that these are different models and different time scales. I'll talk about it a bit more in a moment. Sorry, I'm just going to go back one. Now, I am going to show you an ad in a moment. You just saw it very briefly there because my fingers slipped. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this ad, or indeed that the company that ran it, is solely responsible for the enormous explosion of short-termism that we've met. But I want to show you this ad, which is referred to in the book, because I think it encapsulates the thinking that is so prevalent now in marketing, and so prevalent particularly in the digital world. And I'm not arguing that this thinking is wrong, I'm just arguing that it is limited. And that if we only go down this route, we leave ourselves open to all sorts of risks. So this is the ad. It ran in a very popular business magazine with a marketing kind of twist in it in the UK about 6 or 7 years ago. And look, let's be clear about this. This is a very seductive logic that lots and lots of businesses around the world have been sucked into. The idea that the least wasteful way of spending advertising money is to use people's digital trail, their data trail, to identify when they're about to buy and then and only then serve an advertising message to them. It's a very seductive message. And for a hair salon, perhaps with 1 or 2 outlets, who doesn't have the scope or opportunity to truly pursue brand building as a route, it makes enormous sense. And it also makes great sense as a proportion of the expenditure of a massive global brand. But the problem is that people have bought into this line of thinking so much that they have abandoned brand building in favor of pursuing data-led last-minute marketing. And the point I want to make to you, time and time again through this presentation, is that that is a really limited way of thinking, and if we do that, we walk away from enormous benefits. Enormous potential growth drivers, enormous potential profit drivers. This is a limited model of thinking. Let's not imagine for a moment it's the only way forward. And I picked up this quote from Eric Reynolds, when he was CMO of Clorox. it encapsulates, I think, how the digital kind of marketing world has picked up and run with this idea. Contained within this short paragraph, I think, is the disdain and loathing for the old brand building model that so many people in digital have. Just read it. We don't have marketing run by marketers. Oh, you can just sense the derision and disdain, can't you? We're engineers. Whoa. Now look, I have an engineering degree. I know the beast here. I've got to confess that to you. I know how difficult people from that kind of background have often in understanding the fluffy emotional world of advertising. They just don't get it. It's something deeply scary. We work on growth, as if marketers weren't interested in growth. Where do these people come from? I don't know. Clearly, Eric chose not to name this guy, and I can quite understand why. And then they went on, and this is where finally the derision just oozes out. Branding is really that emotional drizzle that you guys put on top. Now, if I haven't, by the end of this presentation, convinced you that that is probably the most stupid thing you will ever read coming from someone who works in marketing, then I will have failed. And also, if I haven't convinced you that emotional drizzle is the most valuable thing you can possibly have if you're trying to build profits for a business, then I will also have failed. And you have my permission to throw something very hard at me at the end of this presentation. That is dumb with a capital D, but it has been an incredibly seductive kind of way of thinking. This is kind of Silicon Valley all over. What has it led to? It's led to this. Now, this happens to be New Zealand data, but I could show you data from the UK, the US, any market around the world. We've seen this amazing explosion of what I call digital data-driven activation. So this excludes social. It's just search and targeted and retargeted display and digital display. So this is essentially using people's data to target advertising messages at them, probably at the last moment, as close to the point of consumption as possible. You've now broken through the $1 billion barrier. That's an extraordinary amount of advertising money. You know that advertising budgets in New Zealand have not been growing that fast. This money has been coming from somewhere. It didn't come from Father Christmas. It has come from brand building budgets. If you add into that activation spend using traditional media, you are now well over half of your budget. Well over half of typical New Zealand budgets are now being spent on short-term activation. Now, as I will argue here, that is well out of line with optimum. That is far too much money. I am not saying all of this money is unwisely spent. I'm saying too much of it is going down this route. We need to rein it back, and we need to rein it back fast. There is some early evidence from the first quarter of 2019 data that maybe the growth is moderating. I'd love to believe that. It may be driven by other things. But this is the nub of the problem. It's diverting money from brand building. Why do I bang on about this? Well, there's a huge deception of the short-term model, which I've already begun to allude on. That if you look at what you typically get when you go down this short-term data-driven kind of route, is you get a whole series of spikes. You can get very powerful spikes if your message is very powerful, but they're not very memorable. The effects decay very rapidly. And so what you find is you're not driving year-on-year growth. You have to keep serving these messages time and time again simply to stay still. And of course, the costs of doing so are rising. So it's not a very attractive growth model in the long term. Give you a great quarter, perhaps a great weekend. It's an important part of the mix, but it is not a long-term growth driver. But a lot of businesses think it is, and that's the way they've gone. If you want to drive long-term growth, the much better model is brand building. So the short-term effects of the brand building approach may well be less powerful. They usually are less powerful. It takes a long time to build a brand. It requires us communicating and reinforcing those messages over time. So the steps tend to be smaller, but the decay rates are so much slower. You remember some of these fantastic campaigns. I was talking to Paul earlier about the bugger campaign for Toyota, I think it was. Now, I still remember that, and I never even saw the ads. I got it virally around the world. Great campaigns, great ideas. You remember them for decades in some instances. They just don't decay in the same way. So the effects accumulate if we continue to invest behind them. But it's not just a question of driving volume growth. This represents impact on volume. The other great strength of brand building is it has a unique ability to drive pricing power, which you just do not get from the short-term model. If anything, you weaken pricing power when you go down the short-term route. And again, it's massively overlooked. Additional problem is the cusp point at which brand building starts to take over as the dominant driver of growth is around about 6 months. That's not just this database. I've done similar analysis with an Australian database, came to exactly the same conclusion, that 6 months is the point, roughly speaking, at which brand building starts to accelerate ahead. So if you measure success in the short term, if you're driven by quarters or less, you will be operating on the left-hand end of that chart, and you will come to the conclusion that activation is the most powerful way of driving results. And you'd be right, but only in the short term. If you are smart enough to also measure success in the long term, to look at annual and longer kinds of success metrics, you will come to precisely the opposite conclusion, which is that brand building is the dominant driver of growth, and you would be absolutely right. So look, it's not a question of choice. No business on this planet should choose between these two models. You should be doing them both, and you should be doing both in balance, and that will be the subject of the last part of my presentation. But there's an additional problem going on here as well, which is what I'm going to refer to as the ROI trap. A lot of businesses are very driven by ROI. It sounds a very sensible thing to do. Why would you not want to be driven by return on investment? Well, here's the problem. If we are using it as a decision metric, short-term particularly, to decision metric between, say, campaign A, campaign B, media B, or strategy A or strategy B, it becomes extremely dangerous. I'm not saying don't measure it, but it is a secondary metric, not a primary metric. It's very dangerous. So let's just remind ourselves what happens here. These are the top drivers of profit. This is the correlations of each of these metrics with the profit metric. And you can see all the usual suspects are there. Sales gain, market share gain, penetration, pricing, all the ones you would expect, those core kind of P&L metrics that you would expect. The basket of them all, large business effects, correlates really strongly with profit growth. That's why we tend to use it as a proxy metric. Note in there the fourth one down, which is the number of brand effects. So the extent to which we strengthen the brand is a really important driver of profit growth over the long term. A lot of people completely overlook that. So if we walk away from brand building, we walk away from one of the key drivers of profit growth over the long term. Now, at the very bottom of that list are activation effects, these short-term sales effects, but they do correlate with return on investment. Of course, they are important. I'm not denying that. They just happen to be the least important of those metrics. And then lastly, at the very bottom is ROI, which correlates most weakly and at a low level of significance. Now, that tells me that ROI is not a brilliant metric for maximizing ROI, but it doesn't tell me it's a dangerous one. This is where it gets dangerous, because if we pursue ROI alone, or as our primary success metric, we're only going to do one thing. We're going to go for short-term results, activation. It's the only metric that strongly, positively correlates with ROI. It's all about low-hanging fruit. If you want to maximize ROI, what you want to do is find a way of driving probably mediocre growth at minimal cost. You're going to go for the easy wins, easy growth, easy sales, the customers that probably know us and have already bought from us before. We're going to do all of that kind of stuff. The last thing we're going to do is reach out and try and bring new customers into the brand. So most of the key metrics that are so important to businesses don't even correlate significantly with ROI. And the one that we should be most worried about is the very bottom one, very large penetration growth, bringing new customers into our brand. The very metric that the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and Byron Sharp would tell us is the most important driver of growth in the long term, and he's right. Penetration growth, if anything, negatively correlates with ROI, because it's the very opposite of low-hanging fruit. It means I've got to go and persuade people who've never heard of my brand, possibly don't even like it, they certainly don't think about it, to come and buy me. And that's going to take time and money to do. So the ROIs are pretty awful for that kind of thing. But you've got to do that if you want to grow long term. There's no way you can have your cake and eat it. You can't have maximum ROI and maximum growth. They pull you in opposite directions. That's the fact. And we've overlooked that massively. So you need brand and activation. You need them both. You need them both in balance. We'll talk about the balance later. Just let me prove that point. Divide our 600 case studies into 4 piles. Dunce's corner on the left, the ones who achieved low brand building effects and didn't do much to drive short-term sales either. So we're going to have low expectations of those on my broad business effectiveness metric here. The second column is the new model that has seduced so many marketers around the world, which is to say, we're not going to do any of this emotional drizzle stuff. That's so last millennium. That's for weirdos and, kind of pot smokers and all of those people who don't really understand business. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to be super hard driven by ROI and, all short-term effects. The third column is, if you like, the old-fashioned model. The kind of model that says, we just love doing the brand building piece. We don't hold with all this scary new digital marketing stuff. We're not going to do that. That's for young Turks. We're just going to do the old brand building bit. That's the third one. And the fourth column is the one that my colleague Les Binet and I kind of advocate for, the ones who do both. They build the brand to drive long-term growth, and they activate the hell out of it in the short term using all of those scary digital techniques. And when you do that, this is what you see, and it's a no-brainer. What you learn from this is 2 things. Firstly, that if you want to be as successful as possible, you have to do both, the last column. You can't choose one or the other. But the second thing you learn from that is that it is brand building that is the most important driver of growth, that without it, you will underperform badly. So we've got to do both, but it is particularly daft to drop the brand building bit of the equation in favor of activation. Now, at this point, a lot of people say to me, yeah, Peter, but we work in a really fast-moving category. We have to be super agile. We have to be able to turn on a dime. We can't wait around for 6 months to crop up. We'd be dead by then. We've got to be super agile. Sounds so convincing. It's very important. So this doesn't apply to us. Well, let's just test drive that piece of thinking. So we're going to look at the ability of businesses at brands to drive those short-term effects, if you like, to be super agile, depending on how much effort they put into building their brand, how successful they were. So left-hand column did nothing to build the brand, middle column did a bit, right-hand column did a lot to build the brand. And this is something we have known for decades, that if you want to be a very agile business, able to turn on sales very quickly, it doesn't half help to have a strong brand behind you. It's really difficult to turn sales on powerfully. If people have never heard of you, don't really like you, certainly don't have any value for you over and above your competition. We've known this for decades. This is not new news. I feel a charlatan even reminding audience of this, but there are thousands and thousands of people, particularly those who work in digital marketing, who have forgotten this, or they never knew it. They never bothered to learn it. It's so important. But it's not just that. Don't forget, I've already talked about pricing power. What this teaches us, again, is that it is more or less a straight line relationship between the extent to which we strengthen our brand and the likelihood we have of being able to improve pricing power. Walk away from brand building, and you essentially walk away from pricing power, which you already know. Let me give you an example of that. I'm not going to play the ad, but this is the character featured in, if you like, this is the acid test of brand building. This is a UK insurance brand called Churchill. This is their cuddly mascot who features in their ad. It's kind of sweet. It's not good enough for me to want to show to you all, but it's a kind of sweet campaign. But this is a viciously competitive, cutthroat, price-driven market. Online insurance, through aggregator sites, price comparison websites. The very environment that the guys in digital teach us, there is no point in having a brand. It's all about clever use of data and, serving the right price to the right people at the right time. These guys beg to differ, but they've got this is owned by the Direct Line Group. They have 3 brands. Direct Line, which we'll come back to later on, which they use as a direct sell brand. But they have 2 brands that they sell on price comparison websites, actually against one another. This one they support regularly and have done for many years. Another brand, which they call Privilege, which they haven't supported for almost 10 years now. It's an abandoned brand. It's a fantastic laboratory experiment. Supported brand, abandoned brand. Do you think it makes any difference to the trading power of those 2 businesses on a price comparison website, on an aggregator price? Do you think it makes any difference at all? Of course it does. One of them's a brand. The other one's a forgotten product. So let's look at it. Well, this is first look at the brand metrics, just to prove that there is a big difference. So this in the red bars are the Churchill brand, the blue bars are the abandoned privilege brand. So it did once have some relevance to the UK, but you have to have a bit of a long memory to really have any sense of what that brand's about. So you can see across all the key metrics, various awareness metrics, consideration, trustworthiness, there is a very, very significant difference in the strength of those two brands. Let's see how it plays out in terms of click-through rates. So this is people clicking through from the price comparison site to the transactional site of the insurer in order to follow through and buy. And you can see an enormous difference between those two brands. When they are priced at the same rank, so the ranking here is their price ranking, typically the Churchill brand will trade almost twice as powerfully, twice as strongly at the same pricing point as privilege. They work out that some may get typically, for every policy they sell, they're getting somewhere between a 10 and 20 pound, that's 20 to $40 New Zealand, difference in premium. They can charge that much more because it is a brand. It's been an enormously profitable journey for them. They're making a lot of money out of that particular business. But that isn't the end of it, actually. There's a backstory to this, which is that the kinds of customers you attract to a non-brand like privilege, which can only trade on price, turn out to be much higher risks than the kinds of brand you attract through the kind of customers you attract through a proper brand. You know, they're reckless young men. Anyone in the audience like that? Surely not. So they get a double whammy here. They not only get a bigger margin, they can charge more for the policy, but their claims that they have to pay out for on the back of that policy tend to be a whole lot lower. These guys have done incredibly well. Everyone is trying to copy them now. Everyone is leaping in on this. They had some very nice years, which they're now going to have to fight to maintain. But again, let's just turn to the venerable man of investment, Warren Buffett. He's known this for decades. He's on record as saying the single most important decision in evaluating a business is pricing power. And pricing power only comes from brand power in these kinds of businesses. That's why he was so critical of Kraft Heinz, who had chosen to walk away from brand building, in favor of some sort of trendy activation-driven model. So I've banged on about it enough, so I should probably pull this to a close. But let me just prove to you finally that this short-term model is a dangerous and bankrupt one. So this is only part of the problem. This measures the proportion of case studies in this database, this IPA database, that were short-term. And we can see that just before, but around the time of the GFC, short-termism exploded, partly due to the financial pressures of the GFC, but also the whole digital infrastructure telling us that we should just use people's data to serve ads at people at the last moment. Explosion of that. It's not only about the duration of campaigns, it's also about the kinds of tactics that we use, this data-driven last-term kind of approach. This is what happened to effectiveness at the same time, and it's still falling now. I mean, it's a terrifying drop. We're back pretty much to where we were in typical effectiveness levels at the turn of the millennium, having had some fantastic years in the meantime when we were doing things in balance, but we were still, combining brand building and activation in some sensible way and taking advantage of the fantastic capabilities of the new digital tools that are at our disposal. But we were using them sensibly and at a sensible level then. What's now happened is we've gone way past peak and it keeps on plummeting. In the book, there is an earlier version of this chart. We only could do it as far as 2016 then, and I'm terrified to say that it's carried on down since. So I don't kid myself for a moment that I have in any way turned this super tanker around. There may be a few blue chip marketers around the world who've realized this terrible mistake and are beginning to do something about it, but there's an enormous underbelly of businesses who have yet to realize that there's a terrible problem. So hopefully I have now convinced you that brand building is terribly important. It's not just important to long-term volume growth, but it's vitally important to pricing power and to the very bedrock of the profitability of businesses. So it's not a piece of fluffy emotional drizzle. This is not for the pot smokers. This is for the hard-nosed business people amongst us. Brands are about business. So let me move on then to reprise some of the key observations we have, the 7 rules, if you like, for long-term effectiveness. And we'll look at some examples as we go through that I think illustrate how to do it well. So the first one And this in many ways is the kind of mother rule, because a lot of the other rules we're going to observe in a sense relate to this. All of these 7 rules interrelate. This is not a question of cherry picking them. I'm not going to use rule number 2 and rule number 5 because that suits me, but I'm going to ignore the others. They're all interrelated. And as I say, the mother of them is very much about mental availability. This is Byron Sharp, who I'm sure you will know. If you don't know him, I'll send him around to beat you up. How Brands Grow, Part 2, fantastic books. What he teaches us, and his colleagues teach us from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, is that mental availability is a key driver of growth. If we are not increasing mental availability of our brands, alongside physical availability, which he also talks about, but here we're really talking about what advertising can do. Mental availability is vital to drive growth, and it's a complex thing. It's not simple. It's not just a question of awareness. He defines it as a complex property that defines the propensity of the brand to be noticed and or thought of in buying situations. So it's a conflation of saliency and the extent to which our brand is strongly associated with that category and the virtues of that category. So, if I think of cheese, I'm going to think of perhaps one of the Fonterra brands. Or if I'm thinking of freshness, I'm going to think of that, if that's a virtue. So this is really what we're talking about. It's quite complex. It's not one metric. It's a basket of metrics that we all need to move forward on. And the data I work with absolutely backs Byron's observations, because what we see in this data is brands that work along a spectrum, from mere brand awareness, by which I mean whether we've heard of that brand. And at that level, what we're likely to do is passively accept the brand. So it'll be somewhere in our consideration set, but it's unlikely to be very near the top because it's all very passive. If we move forward to what I call the salience level, which is where our brand starts to come very easily to mind, we get all sorts of kind of psychological kind of support to purchase decisions. It becomes cognitively easy to choose that brand. It becomes an obvious choice. So we start to get the benefits of that, and people start to actively seek our brand. A brand that is widely known is likely to be a good brand. So that's the next stage, and that is a more positive stage to be at. And then there's this ultimate level, which we talk quite a lot about in the book and in many of the pieces of work that I've done, where we get to the fame level, where people start talking about our brand, talking about the campaign. And at that level, you get real cognitive ease, because a brand that everyone's talking about has got to be a smart choice. It couldn't possibly be a dumb thing to buy if everyone is talking about it. But also you get the whole benefits of influence and advocacy that come from that. And what we find in this database is that as you move along that spectrum from simply creating awareness to these much higher levels of mental availability, you get increasing returns in all the key business metrics, but obviously profitability particularly. Let me just give you some examples of that. So fame campaigns are much, much more efficient. So this is my efficiency metric, which you'll see a few more examples of in a minute. It measures bang for bucks. How much market share growth do we drive per annum for every unit of investment that we put behind that campaign? And you can see there that fame campaigns are getting on for 4 times as efficient as non-fame campaigns, the ones that just don't get talked about. It's a no-brainer. If we can do it, we should want to do it. Of course, what this doesn't show us is that it's actually quite difficult to be in that A team of fame campaigns. I'll show you some examples in a moment, but these are creatively clever. They are the results of a lot of hard work and good thinking when we do it. So it's not easy to join that club. But they also have a much bigger impact on pricing power as well, because we're generally speaking prepared to pay more for the brands that everyone is talking about. And again, that's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? It's kind of bleeding obvious, I know. So these tend to be very, very profitable campaigns. They tend to drive profit growth very strongly. That's the great thing about them. So let me pose the question, what drives fame? Because we now know quite a lot about this. We knew quite a bit about it anyway from just looking at the case studies that drove fame most powerfully. But we now have a new study where we have fused some really interesting video response data that Unruly have in their database with the fame metrics that we have in the IPA database. So what we've done is for about 60 different video-based campaigns where we have data from both these sources, we've looked at what are the key drivers of fame response. And when you do that, and I'm just going to pull out, first of all, the top 5 metrics from the Unruly They have about 18 different video response measures. What are the top 5 that correlate with fame? And at a very simple level, they are all essentially about surprise. They're all about surprise. Extreme surprise in shock, surprise, amazement, which is kind of slightly diluted, disgust, which is the flip side of surprise. As long as we resolve it carefully in the ad, that can be a big powerful of fame. And then hilarity, extreme humor. Humor is by its nature surprising. Good jokes always have a twist that we weren't seeing coming in them. So you could characterize the key driver of fame as surprise. If we want to join this A-team, we are going to have to be doing something that our customers, our consumers are not expecting. It's going to take us outside our comfort area. We're going to have to do something that is unfamiliar, unexpected, and probably outside the normal rules of the category. So this is not for the faint-hearted. If you're not up for it, don't waste your time. Just stick for the less effective, safe routes. But there are huge rewards for doing this. Now, here's the unfortunate thing. The second bottom metric that correlates with fame, and it correlates negatively, which is to say that the more you do it, the less likely you are to drive fame, is unfortunately the very thing that the data-driven activation route teaches us we should do, which is to communicate information or knowledge. That is negatively correlated to quite a significant degree with fame. So when you do that, let's be clear, it has a good impact on short-term activation, but when we go down that route, we kiss goodbye. We don't just kiss goodbye, we snog goodbye really long and hard to our chances of driving fame. That's a decision you're going to make when you go down that route. Don't kid yourself, but do it for the activation bit. So look, there's just a couple of examples. You deserve a commercial break now. I often talk about Snickers. It's been a fantastic case study. A lot of people say, how do you do fame globally? These guys have taught us how to do it globally. They didn't get there overnight, but they've got there now. I'll talk about the success, but it's founded on a lovely insight, of course, which is the you aren't you when you're hungry. This is a bar that satiates hunger. The strategy hasn't changed in decades. The delivery changed of it about 6 or 7 years ago when they came up with that brilliant campaign insight. This is their latest ad. It just seems to get better and better as the years go by. So this is their latest ad, which you may have seen.
Eat a Snicker. You always lose your edge when you're hungry. Better.
Better. Yo, I said, give me the track. I'm finna snap. See me in the jack. We got snapped. But goddamn, you can't rap. Shouldn't catch the fly. You're not you when you're hungry. I know I'm trash. Better tell me Snickers.
So as you're going to see, this enshrines a lot of the virtues, a lot of the 7 rules in here. But the key thing about it is this is always surprising. It's been going for 6 or 7 years. They can still generate surprise because they've got such a fantastic campaign idea. Does it work? Hell yeah. Just one point. I just want you to note the kind of ROIs. That's quite a low ROI by the standards of this database, 59%. It's quite a low ROI. If you were driven by ROI, you'd probably pull the rug on this campaign, But you wouldn't if you were interested in growth. Did it grow? Yeah. Now, I have to say, I don't know what happened in Saudi Arabia, which is the big negative bar. I'm assuming the chocolate melted or something. I don't really know. But in every other market, they seem typically, on average, about 10% growth. It's a phenomenal success story. Awesomely profitable for them. I mean, Mars really understand this. They are a great client for their agencies. And in particular, this campaign sought from the word go to drive fame. That was the model they chose to pursue, and it has really paid off for them. A lot of people say, yeah, come on, Peter, but that's TV, big budget, global brands. How can this work for, a national brand with modest budgets in a smaller country? So I'm going to show you a Danish case study. So Denmark's slightly bigger in population terms than New Zealand. I think their population is about 6 million, but it's not vast. It's much smaller geographically, of course. Now, this is a case study. It's a pure digital play. It's an online video play, pretty much. I mean, there may have been a bit of TV, but I don't think there was much to play. Not much there, just a seeding. So this is essentially pure online video. So you can build fame. You can pursue this model with a pure online video route. But this is the creative level you have to operate at. This is really seriously high-level stuff. You've certainly got to be controversial. So this campaign targets millennials who increasingly were turning away from package holidays, wanting to do their own thing. So they were trying to reinvigorate package holidays amongst the millennial market. And as we're relentlessly told, millennials, of course, don't watch any TV, ever. Of course, it's rubbish, but anyway, sometimes it can be much cheaper to get them using online video if you've got a great idea like this. But that's the point I want to make. So, it is a campaign aimed at millennials. It's about travel and fun, and it's Danish. It's going to be about sex, okay? So you have been warned. Let's watch the video. It's quite long, but enjoy.
Men der må være en løsning. Her er Emma. Hun er dansker, men selvom hun er født og opvokset i Danmark, er hun undfanget i Paris. Lige deroppe, hvor det der hotelværelse. For 30 år siden tog Emmas forældre en lille svigtur. Hvis vægge kunne tale. Men det viser sig, at Emmas historie ikke er så enestående. 10% af alle danske børn er undfanget på en ferie.
At rejse og få nye oplevelser, det påvirker parforholdet, fordi de får overskud til at se og opleve hinanden på ny. Det frigør endorfiner i hjernen, og så får folk lyst til sex. Det får børn af.
Faktisk har danskerne 46% mere sex på ferie sammenlignet med hverdagen. Så for at hjælpe den faldende danske fødselsrate, vil Spis opfordre alle danskere til at tage på en romantisk storbyferie. Det hjælper selvfølgelig også lidt på vores fremtidige forretning. Men er det ikke motivation nok at gøre det for Danmark, så har vi lavet en lille konkurrence. Book din rejse med vores æggeløsningsrabat. Bevis du har undfanget et barn og vind 3 års forbrug af æggeløsning er en børnelig ferie. Men hvad nu, hvis du allerede har gjort din pligt? Eller hvis chancerne for at undfangelse ikke er særlig høje, men så se på det sådan her. Det handler ikke kun om at vinde. Det handler om at være med. Deltag i konkurrencen. Do it for Denmark.
Now that is how to do integrated brand and activation. I think that's one of the most fantastic activation ideas with the nappy promotion that I've ever seen. So fantastic, and the interesting thing about this is you might think, well, this was just some kind of one-off stunt. Absolutely not. They ran this campaign for 3 years. The next year they did Do It for Mum, which was about how grandparents need grandchildren to keep them healthy and young, so Do It for Denmark, all of that. And there was a iteration the 3rd year as well. So this is a proper long-term campaign idea that really delivered for them. Budget-wise, well, it wasn't a giveaway. I mean, you've got to get this out there in social media and so forth. Nobody's going to do that for nothing, and you've got production costs. They spent over 2 years, according to the case study, a little bit over New Zealand equivalent to $1 million New Zealand dollars. So it's not a giveaway. But, this is not big budget stuff. Note the ROI, which is about twice what the Snickers campaign achieved. So again, these can deliver good ROI, these kinds of campaigns. The growth is impressive. It's not really quite as amazing over such a long time as the growth that Snickers has seen, but nevertheless, very, very significant. It worked, certainly for the first 2 years, and the 3rd year, we don't know because the case study stopped then. So this is a proven route, but the point I want to make is that if you want to succeed in an online video play alone, that is the kind of material you're going to have to be able to produce. There is no sense in which watching 3 seconds of that with the sound turned off would have had remotely that kind of result. Okay? But who the hell is going to want to watch just 3 seconds of that with the sound turned off? You know, once you start watching that, you watch it all the way through. So let's be clear, if you have powerful video, powerful creative ideas, you can make online video work on its own. But that's the level you have to turn to. Now, another medium that's been well used over the years for fame, particularly because it is very conspicuous and everyone sees it, and it's having an amazing growth run in New Zealand, just as it is in the UK, is outdoor. Partly driven by digital outdoor, which of course gives it new capabilities, particularly in the winter. But anyway, it is in many ways the traditional medium of the moment. So here is an example of a campaign that used outdoor to wonderful effect to build fame. This was the launch of Paddy Power in the UK. This is a few years old now. It's about 8 years old now, I think. This was an Irish bookmaker launching into a very crowded and aggressively defended gambling marketplace in the UK. They knew they had to do something special. They had limited budgets to do it. They had a lovely insight, which is that serious gamblers will gamble on anything. You know, they'll gamble on whether that spider is going to make it across the floor quicker than that spider. You know, they're obsessive about it. So they had that lovely insight. But they knew they had to do something that was going to get talked about because they didn't have money. So this poster I'm about to show you, it's a bit disgraceful, if we're brutally honest. It got banned. Some of the others didn't get banned. But I mean, it started the conversation. So look, I can't possibly in any way support the thinking behind this poster, though I smirk at it just as you do. So if there's anyone here from road safety in New Zealand, my deepest apologies to you. This is disgraceful, of course it is, but it's a joke. It's a joke. But of course it plays to the gambler's mentality. And like I say, the others didn't. Now, these guys were profitable in the UK by the end of year one. They trebled their online customer base at the end of year one with this relatively low budget campaign. It was a great success. So that's number one. I better race on. I don't want to run out of time. So the second is aim for distinctiveness, and this is in many ways related to mental availability because distinctiveness is the best way of achieving mental availability. But here we have to be clear about what we mean. And Byron Sharp, again, has written about this, and he talks about how many brands tie themselves in knots by trying to differentiate their brand from the competition, by which we mean functional differentiation. So they focus on some minor, almost irrelevant point of differentiation. And they think, well, that is our point of difference, so we're just going to plow that furrow until it comes good. And of course, it never really comes good because it's not fundamentally relevant. Distinctiveness is something different. It's about, creating something notable about this brand, usually through emotional brand building. We can be unique and distinctive in the world of emotional brand building in a way that we simply cannot be in the world of functional differentiation. And you see that played out here. So this is the uplift to effectiveness metrics between those campaigns that did adopt that strategy versus those that didn't. Differentiation, I'm not saying it's totally ineffective, but it's pretty weak. Whereas distinctiveness is the most important of those objectives that we can look at. And here we're aggregating awareness and fame as the key objective. They are the ones that really drive success. Let me give you a practical example of that. I'm not going to play the ad because I don't want to send anyone to sleep at this stage in the afternoon, and I certainly don't want to lose you. So this is an ad for Garnier Ultralift. It's a product aimed at people of a certain age who start to get worried about their wrinkles, and I refuse to admit whether I use this kind of product at all. So, it's all very scientific, lots of product benefits, very technical. They've even developed this wrinkle reader thing so you can just see how wrinkly you are. You can see how terrible your problem is. And hopefully you can see how much less wrinkly you get the more the product you use. Classic product benefit reason why advertising. Classic differentiation advertising. Banging on about a product benefit. This is really interesting. This is the sales response curve. So we see some big peaks. It works just like activation. This kind of advertising is essentially activation advertising. We get some big peaks, but within about 2 to 3 weeks of the end of each of those bursts of activity, we're straight back down to trend, which unfortunately was negative at the time. So it didn't really do anything long-term short term, it did very well. Now, contrast that, if you will, with this campaign, which, although it's quite a moving ad, I'm not going to play to you. This is Procter & Gamble's Enduring Care campaign they ran for Fairy, some other brands supported under the same banner, where it's a classic brand purpose thing. They put money into a charity aimed at giving really sick children some fun in their lives, possibly the end of their lives. So this is a kid who got to boss a rowing 8 around because that's what he'd always wanted to do. It's a very moving piece of film. Absolutely nothing about the product in there. There's no one washing up. There's no foam and suds. Well, it may have been shot on the River Thames. There may have been a few suds in the water, but that's another story. This is not about the product. This is about an emotional, feel-good film, make us want to feel good about the brand and the company behind it, but done in a good way. Now, really, really different kind of sales response. So there was an 18-month period between these two big bursts where there was very little advertising. It's not a perfect experiment because there were some little mini bursts of advertising in that gap. But that is 18 months, that gap. And there's at least a 6-month gap between those little mini bursts. Sales didn't fall off a cliff when they stopped advertising. This took this brand from, as you can see, about a 50 share to almost a 70 share. And that's one hell of an ask for a brand in any market. It did that, through emotional goodwill and all of that. But when they pulled the plug on advertising for a period of time, sales didn't fall on a cliff. They just gradually leveled out and then gradually started to trend down until the next burst came along and then the trend was reversed. That is the benefit of a kind of brand building approach which is about distinctiveness as opposed to differentiation. Emotional engagement versus product benefit. Which brings me neatly to my next point. I said these were all interrelated. It's very difficult to actually completely isolate them. But you've seen in the first two of these rules the value of emotional engagement and going down the emotional brand building route. So here you see the first bit of the evidence. Emotional campaigns, those that change the way we feel about brands, are just over 3 times as powerful in terms of this efficiency metric as those who are rational, seek to communicate information, like the Garnier Ultralift ad. But if we look at the fame campaigns, which are, if you like, emotions on steroids, they don't just make me feel different about the campaign, they make me want to share that with everyone. Those are massively more, almost 10 times as efficient. That's why fame is so important. But it is emotions on steroids. But here's the first of many warnings to you. That is a long-term metric, annual at minimum. What would happen? What would be the picture that we would see if we measured success in the very short term, using those immediate kind of digital metrics that we all love so much today, it's kind of immediate kind of stuff. What would we see? Well, what we'd see is that rational campaigns outperform, not by a huge margin, but they outperform emotional campaigns. We'd never go down the emotional route. And of course, lots of people who pursue that short-term agenda do precisely that. They go down the rational route. Here's an example of one. I mentioned Clorox earlier. So this is Eric Reynolds speaking at the ANA conference in 2017, talking about the problem he had addressed as a marketer. And we'll look at the ad he ran in a moment. We realized we were shoving people through a purchase funnel to get them over the finish line. And guess what? It got very rational, it got very functional, and we had a lot of price promotion offers. And that's what he sought to do. So he moved this brand on a journey from this kind of advertising, and this was an outdoor site that they ran, classic product benefit reason why. He moved them from that to a very emotional TV ad. And this is from the US. I really admire this journey. It is tough to do this as a marketer for a company like Clorox. It's a bleach-based brand, for heaven's sake. How can you be emotional about bleach? And it's a lovely idea, and there's some other lovely ads in that campaign. It's worth having a look and see what you can do. So you can do this in lots of markets, and this is the value of the emotional. I call it emotional priming. if we like the brand, if we feel good about the brand, we tend to believe all the positive stuff. We believe this is a more effective product. We don't have to tell people it's more effective. We're just going to believe it because you know what, we want to believe it. And this is all straight out of Daniel Kahneman's System 1 kind of thinking, for those of you who are interested in that. The next one, again, this is totally related to fame and emotions, which is about creativity. So creativity, one of the great things about creativity is because it's all about the original. To get a creative award, you have to have done something that no one's done before. So it's inherently fresh and original and surprising. So it presses the fame button. So here is the latest update of the data. This is a 20-year look back at all the creatively awarded case studies in this database. It's just short of 20% of the case studies in the database picked up a major creative award at one of the top 46 shows around the world. And they are typically just short of 10 times as efficient as those that didn't. That's an amazing difference. I mean, why wouldn't you want to go down this route? Of course, it's difficult. It is, of course, difficult. Let me give you just one example of this, and I'll move on. So creativity involves fresh, original surprise. And this, I think, is in many ways a very interesting ad because it is very brave. This is for Maltesers, another Mars brand in the UK. But again, it illustrates the importance of thinking long-term if you want to go down the creativity route. Because this ad was originally developed in response to a competition run by a TV channel in the UK, Channel 4, to produce an ad that celebrated disability. You know, it was all about disability inclusion in society. So it had to feature disabled people, but in a positive way that disabled people would appreciate and benefit. So they came up with this ad. I think it's very brave. I'd give them 10 out of 10 for running this. It could have gone either way, but actually it went very well for them. But remember, it was a competition for, I think, £1 million worth of free airtime. It could have run once and only once, and then they could have run away and done something more predictable and safe. But this ad really worked for them, and it's still running now 2.5, 3 years later. Here's the ad. Now you'll have to follow this one closely. Racy stuff. Okay. So that's Mars. You know, I give them 10 out of 10 for balls. I mean, this is great. And, you know, it went down very well. People loved it. Disabled people loved it. They admired what it did. And hell, it worked. I mean, they've seen big rises in sales. Not just over the campaign period, but subsequently, like I say, it's still running now about 2.5 years later. There are other ads in the campaign now. So once they realized that they had a great and powerful creative idea, they committed behind it to milk that idea. If you've got a great creative asset, don't throw it away. Milk it. That's what these guys are so good at Mars. But here's a warning, another one of my warnings that we talk about in the book. There is a temptation to go down the short-term route with creativity. So lots of businesses do this. Disposable creativity we talk about. And there is a big danger in this. And the danger is expressed in this chart, which is that the unfortunate feature of creativity is that it builds on itself. It drives long-term growth if we continue to invest behind it. And what we see in this database is that those kind of disposable short-term creative ideas that come and go are actually less effective than non-awarded campaigns. So we're storing up a problem when we do this. So if you have a great creative idea, and it may have been, like this one was, developed for a very particular window, a bit of free airtime, or maybe it was the Super Bowl, or maybe it was Halloween. If it was great and if it worked, find a way to keep on milking and sweating that asset, because great creative ideas are like gold dust. Anyway, I'll say no more now because I haven't come here to rant on about creativity. Let's move on to the next one, which is about consistency. Now, consistency as well in the modern era has become a little bit unfashionable. We always want to kind of keep on moving on to new ideas and new things. Long-running campaigns increasingly kind of regarded as so last millennium. I'm going to show you some research evidence in a moment that was done again by fusing the IPA database with some data that the System 1 agency, that's Brain Juicer as was, have about the use of fluent devices in campaigns. So fluent devices are thoughts, visual ideas, or sonic devices that remain consistent through a campaign over time, but ideally are flexible enough to allow us to innovate with the campaign but still keep something consistent. So you don't need me to introduce you to the first one of these, particularly not our team in the front row here, who obviously knew this was coming up. So some of these are very familiar, but if we take the Mastercard one, for instance, the Priceless campaign, that ran for about 4 years, transformed the success of that brand. It's a great idea, which they reprise later. Or it could be, so that's a campaign idea. It's an idea that drives the storyline of those campaigns. It's not a visual device, a metaphor for the brand, which is the stick man, or just the sonic device of McDonald's, I'm loving it, which again has just become a sign-off that just ties their ads together, and it becomes a distinctive asset, to use Byron Sharp's language. Now these work. Here's the evidence. Those campaigns in this multi-year analysis, and you can see the base sizes, they're quite big. It's about 300 or 400 case studies we've got there. Those that had a fluent device, these consistent devices that we can work with over the years, were almost a third as likely to report very large market share gain, and almost a third as likely to report very large profit gain. So they are valuable things. They may seem old-fashioned to you, sonic devices and logos and all that, but actually they're really valuable. Let me just give you an example from the UK of that. Because again, I'm going to come back to the insurance marketplace, because I think in many ways it is the acid test of brands and brand marketing, because it is so viciously competitive and so crowded. So this is the third of Direct Line Group's brand, the one they sell direct to consumers. How do you fight back against the aggregators, the price comparison websites, in order to sell your brand direct to consumers and take all of the margin for yourself? Well, the way to do it is to develop a really powerful brand idea, and it's expressed through this person, Harvey Keitel, reprising his role as the Mr. Fixer of Pulp Fiction, Winston Wolfe. You would have thought that's a rather unlikely character to feature in an insurance character, a kind of underworld fixer. But actually, if you think about it, it's a really smart, fluent device. Because if you have an insurance claim, this is the kind of person you quite like on your side fighting to get it through. It's the guy who crunches heads, after all. So I'll give you an example of the ad, but there are dozens of these ads that feature. And Harvey Keitel is apparently very involved in all of this. He helps write the scripts. He loves reprising this role. So it has all of the energy, creative energy, of the talent that runs it. It's a great, great example of the power of a fluent device when you've got a good one.
Marcus, you called Direct Line exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes ago. You've got an uncontrollable leak, and you've tried to stop it yourself. The bad news is that Joey here is going to have to remove your ball cock. The good news is that Joey's an emergency plumber, and that's going under your Direct Line Home Plus insurance. What are you going to do to it?
Okay, so I mean, there's a story, there's a product benefit in there, but that's not why these are so successful. So successful because of this really powerful, fluent device, distinctive asset. They're all working together. We just remember this brand. Hugely successful, quite incredible story. About a fifth of the entire profits of this company have come just from running this TV campaign. It's been an enormous impact. Okay, on for number 6. I need to move forward. Reach. So we've lived through more than a decade now of being told that tight targeting is really where it's at. Broad reach is incredibly wasteful, it's dumb, it's last millennium's thinking, it's broadcast mentality. What we should be doing is typically using data to target people tightly. So let's test drive that. So we're going to test drive in 2 different ways. Firstly, in an old-fashioned sense, we're going to look at tightly targeted campaigns in the sense that those that go for existing customers versus slightly more broadly targeted campaigns, the ones that go for new customers, versus those campaigns that say to hell with targeting, let's go for everyone in the category. Very broad targeting. Typically, the campaigns we're told that are terribly wasteful we shouldn't be doing. And we're going to look at success in the long term and success in the short term. So let's look at long term first. And what we find quite clearly there is that if we want to drive growth in the long term, we need to target broadly. We need to reach out to new customers in particular, but we also need to reinforce existing customers' affiliations to our brand. The most powerful drivers of growth are the ones that say, to hell with that fancy smart-ass targeting bit. We're just going to go for everyone in the category. And that's, of course, exactly what Byron Sharp tells us. So Byron Sharp, we are not worthy. He is right, absolutely right. We can be far too clever about targeting. We may not be able to afford to target absolutely everyone in the category, in which case we may have to make some choices, but we still should be driven by breadth of targeting to the maximum extent that we can. But here's the problem, that if we look at short-term effects as a metric, you can see that tightly targeted campaigns, those aiming at existing customers, of course, are more effective in the short term. This is why there's so much confusion about this. People who work in loyalty marketing say, but we can see the effects of this. We can drive this. Because you're talking to people who know your brand, already bought it, like you to some degree. You can stimulate them to make a purchase in the short term, but it's probably going to be brought forward sales, not long-term growth. It doesn't drive growth in the long term. Say a lot of people at this point, yeah, but that's a very old-fashioned view about tight targeting, which indeed it is. These days we don't do it that way. We use big data sets to target people who we know are about to make a purchase right now. We can see from their search behavior or whatever other data set we're using that these people are very likely to make this kind of purchase. Or maybe because of their other behavior, we are using AI to intuit in some way that these people are going to make a purchase right now. And so we're going to serve our message to them right now because they're about to make a purchase. So let's, again, same thing, let's look at the impact that that way of thinking has on long-term and short-term growth. And if you look at long-term, you see exactly the same thing. Those case studies that went down that route of using big data to serve these kinds of real-time last-minute messages walked away from long-term growth. They drove less growth than those case studies that didn't pursue that route. But to give it its credit, what they did drive is incredibly much more powerful short-term effects. So big data, all of those tools that come with it are fantastic at driving short-term effects, but they're not a substitute for long-term brand-built growth. Not a mistake that anyone on the planet needs to make, because our friends at P&G have done the experiment and been very public about the disaster that resulted. As Mark Pritchard from P&G said, we targeted too much, we went too narrow. The bigger your brand, the more you need broad reach and less targeted media. And I'm going to talk about smaller brands in just a minute, because there are some exceptions with startups and smaller brands that mean you don't need brand building so much. Just be clear about it. Big tech themselves know about the value of broad reach traditional media because they're investing massively in it. This is UK data. I could be showing you US data or data from almost any market around the world. So these are the top 8 big tech brands, and this is their spend on traditional media in the UK in recent years. So that's just short of $1 billion New Zealand dollars that they're currently spending per annum on traditional media. Well, draw your own conclusions. I will leave you to draw them in the privacy of your own minds and not dig myself into any trouble. But of course, what these guys have also learnt is that if you want to grow, you need to spend money. You need to budget for it. And there is a law of growth, the share of voice law, which is not changing over time. And that is to say that if you want to drive growth, your share of voice needs to be greater than your share of market. If it isn't, you will shrink. And but that's great in a sense, because if we're a tiny brand with, say, a 1% share of market, we only need to, spend 2% share of voice, and we should expect growth. It doesn't mean we have to have big budgets. It just means we have to have the flexibility to invest slightly ahead of our current size. That law is not weakening. If anything, it's strengthening over time, not going away. So let me move on to the final one, where we talk about balance. I have said to you that we shouldn't make a choice between brand building and activation. We need to do both. Build brands for long-term growth and then activate the hell out of that growing sense of enthusiasm for the short term. So it's all about balance. And balance is not just about how we spend the money, but what kind of media we choose. And for sales activation, this sensibly should all be about tight targeting, because people aren't going to remember these messages, so we need to be able to serve them to people who are about to buy. All of that new model absolutely applies to activation. We need media that can communicate information very powerfully, and media that give us the flexibility where necessary to follow people through the path to purchase and move them as they progress through a funnel, perhaps. And the media, of course, that are great at that are, in general, rational information media, but particularly things like, data-driven targeting, search-targeted and retargeted display advertising, social display, because of their ability to serve that message to the right people at the right time. It's a fantastic tool for activation. Brand building, on the other hand, is a totally different ballpark. What we need is broad reach, because we've got to get to people long before they're going to choose us. So we need a big, broad reach of anyone who might buy our category. We need the kind of media that can deliver an emotional message so that we can prime people to want to buy our brand and remember that days, weeks, months ahead of purchase. And we need media that are proven to be able to build mental availability, drive fame, if you like. And of course, the media that excel at that are emotive audiovisual media, particularly TV and online video, but frankly, I should add outdoor to that as well. Those are the great media. These are very different media, very different considerations. It seems to me daft to try and walk from one side of that to the other. You need both of these on your side, but you need both in balance. So we talk about the 60-40 rule in the book. It's a generalization, and I'll give you some nuances to it in just a second. But it's based on this analysis that says the shape of the curve that relates effectiveness on the vertical axis to how we split our budget between activation, all activation on the left-hand side of that chart, all brand building on the right-hand side of that chart. It relates effectiveness to how we split that budget. You can see there's a very clear peak, which is at around about 60% brand building. It's actually 62%, but keep quiet about that because the 60-40 rule is so much more memorable than the 62-38 rule. But roughly speaking, it's 60-40. Consider the two mistakes we might make. One is we might go the old-fashioned route and say, let's put all our money into brand building and forget the scary digital stuff, in which case we are likely to see a 20% loss of potential effectiveness. But at least one thing will happen, which is that our brand will remain strong, and we could correct that mistake at a moment's notice by rebalancing the budget, and we'd get back to peak in no time at all. The other big mistake we could make, of course, is to go down the pure activation route, and that is, of course, what dozens and dozens of businesses around the world have done, in which case we would see a bigger loss of potential effectiveness, which businesses are now discovering, more than half. But here's the extra problem. That we won't see that overnight, but gradually as the brand weakens, we'll see that happen. But you cannot rebuild a brand in a hurry. It's going to take you at least a year, probably, to rebuild that brand. So you're going to have a pretty tough time in the meantime. And the general rule of thumb that marketers I've talked to say is that it is likely to cost you twice as much to rebuild the brand as it would have done just to have kept it healthy in the first place. So don't go that route if you can possibly avoid it. Of the two mistakes you can make, it is definitely the dumbest. And it is the one that more and more businesses are making. I'll give you a lovely example of that in a minute. So let me just give you some of the data from Effectiveness in Context. I'll go through this very quickly. That just explains why and how that 60-40 sweet spot moves depending on the context of our brand. The general rule is very, very simple. When activation is easy, we don't do more of it, we do more brand building because we're trying to maintain balance. So if we're in a market such as one where the purchase consideration is very high consideration. We do a lot of thinking and probably a lot of research off the back of that. That is a marketplace in which activation is easy. We've got lots of opportunities to serve messages to the people in that, particularly if they're doing research online. Big fat data trails, we can't miss them. So activation is easy in that situation. So what we need to do in high consideration categories is tilt towards brand. So instead of a 60-40 rule, it's closer to a 70-30 rule. So if you're in one of those, that would be my advice to you as a start point. And of course, many financial services categories are in that situation. But they, of course, are the ones that tend to do the least brand building. If, on the other hand, you're in a category where brand building is very easy, those categories where emotional decision-making dominates, it tends to be much easier to build a brand in those. And in those situations, we need to tilt towards activation. So instead of a 60-40 rule, it's more of a 55-45 rule. It's a very, very simple kind of algorithm that's at work here. And you see that played out across lots of different categories. So durables Packaged goods, retail are pretty much in line with 60-40, so in the interest of time I won't talk about those. Financial services, easy to do the activation, difficult to do the brand building. We need to massively tilt towards brand building in financial services. Of all the sectors on this chart, they are the ones who have abandoned brand building most strongly. These are the guys who are teaching us how to screw up. I'm sorry if any of you in here in financial services, but those brands in the UK that have turned back to brand building are having a field day at the moment. So no pun intended. They're having a field day at the moment because so many businesses have abandoned brand building in that category. Other services, complex, that's really driven largely by, there's a lot of very strongly represented categories which have real-time requirements in them. Demand management, quick service restaurants, travel, media, where if that plane flies at half empty, then we never get another chance to sell that seat. So we have to keep those busy. In those situations, activation becomes more important, swings more to 50-50. In not-for-profit, whether they're government or charities, brand building tends to be relatively easy, so again, we need to swing towards activation. What's often difficult in charities or government campaigns is getting people to take that first step, to donate or to change their behavior in some way. So activation in some way becomes more important. It all follows a very, very familiar pattern. I said I would talk very briefly about new brands and startups. Now, you can get away, no doubt about it, at least for the first year or two, of an innovative brand, particularly if it's a very strong, powerful innovation. You can do away with brand building completely. You will grow organically based on kind of virally transmitted trial, if you like. People will try your brand. So we find that in the first year of a new brand launch, typically the optimum is about a 35-65 mix. Not completely. We don't recommend you completely ignore brand building unless you really are a very underfinanced startup, because you need to start sowing the seeds of later growth. But you can get away with it. But somewhere our data suggests around about the 18-month to 2-year period, you reach an inflection point where if you don't start to invest in brand building and you just rely on short-term trial-driving activation, you will underplay the potential for growth. You will underdrive growth. It's a really important point, and lots of businesses miss it because they see those early days as being driven without any of this expensive brand building stuff. So why? I had all that lovely growth. Why would I ever change my model? Well, you need to change your model because competition creeps up and all the early trial has dried up and gone. The easy low-hanging fruit has disappeared, and from here on in, you're going to have to work harder to drive growth. So we see as brands progress from early startup to hopefully great success, that they need to tilt ever more strongly towards brand building as you go forward. So be very careful about being seduced by those early years. There are lots of other factors that work in the market: subscription brands, online selling. In an online sold, very strongly online sold market, activation is easy for obvious reasons, and therefore, when you have an online brand, you need to tilt towards brand building. The online marketplace is a viciously crowded and competitive one. You really need the strength of a brand behind you if you want to succeed there. And because there is a general trend towards online selling and online research and subscription models, all of which play to brand building, what we see is a trend in terms of that sweet spot quite significantly towards brand building. So we've got about a 75-25 rule for the latest sort of 12-year period. But I'm not suggesting you should take that as your start point because it really depends on the context of your brand. If you read Effectiveness in Context, there is a tool there for identifying what should be, roughly speaking, the sweet spot for any business in any category. In some situations, it might be a 40-60 rule. In others, it might be a 60-40 rule. And in others, it might be an 80-20 rule. It will vary. So just work on it. Right, I'm going to finish my wrap, and I hope I've got time to end with a quick case study. This, I hope, will be a little light entertainment at the end. This is the AA. You know the AA because you have the same brand here. It's not Alcoholics Anonymous. It's the Automobile Association, one of the businesses that will come and rescue you when you break down. Now, there was a time when the AA was one of the top 3 most trusted brands in the UK. It was up there with the best of the best. We really revered this. Some people regard it as the 4th emergency service in the UK. We loved this brand. And when you have a brand that strong, it is really difficult to destroy a brand that's strong. But these guys were really determined to destroy this brand. It's a lovely experiment. It took them 10 years of gradually moving away from supporting the brand, ever more towards doing what they saw as hardworking, high ROI, very sensible activation advertising, relying on the past glories of the brand, which of course gradually weaken over time. How do we know they weakened? These are the brand metrics. Let's not dwell on any one of them. This is the last half of that period. All their brand metrics were falling off a cliff, big time. A lot of people, a lot of younger drivers didn't even know this brand. It's an appalling abandonment of a brand. But it's a lovely experiment because it teaches us the dangers of doing so. One of the key dangers, I've talked about pricing power. The people from the AA call the crocodile chart. Not because they're from Australia, but because there's a nasty bite in this chart. And it looks a bit like a crocodile's mouth. So the black line is the price they were able to get when attracting new customers, the come-on price. And it was falling in real terms year on year, getting cheaper and cheaper. In order to make the business numbers add up, at renewal at the end of year one, they had to charge a whole lot more. That's the yellow price. And the two were diverging as the costs of the business obviously grew and so on and so forth. And it had got to the point in 2013 when the renewal premium was typically more than twice the come-on price. So the customer might have been charged $100 to sign up to the AA, but at first renewal, they got stung with $220 renewal premium. Now, people are not idiots. They see what's going on, and they defect. They dump the AA, and this is what was happening. Massive defections and disloyalty moving to cheaper competitors, which meant they had to offer ever more sweeter kind of come-on rates to catch them back. Despite that, they were still losing market share. So this only tells half the short story. They were losing market share despite a completely unsustainable pricing model, and the modelers at the company predicted the complete collapse of the business within 5 years. So what are you going to do? You've got an abandoned brand. You've got defections. You've got loss of pricing power. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to brand build. You're going to get back to investing in the brand. And if you're smart, you're going to do that using the most proven medium for brand building, which is, of course, TV. Whoa, who said TV? It happens to be the case still right now. By a long, long way, TV is the most powerful brand building medium. And these guys use it. Here's the TV ad that they ran. So it's a sweet and classic feel-good movie. And okay, it is a product demo, but that's not why it worked so well. It's just we started to love the brand again. And when you love the brand, you believe all the good stuff and you want to do business with it. Now, let's be clear about this. You know, it wasn't only driven by brand building. These guys moved from 100 activation, 0 brand to about a 60-40 mix. And they still did a lot of activation, direct response TV, digital stuff that still did the typical activation stuff. It's not pure, you know, we're not saying brand building on its own can turn around the business. But turn around it did, astonishing rebound. They recovered their market share inside a year, but all the other important things came with it, brand metrics. Branded searches, obviously very important to a cost-effective search-driven marketing. Acquisition increased, retention increased as well. But despite the fact they had to do a whole lot less discounting, and they even managed to sneak in a price increase. It's transformed the profitability of the business. And I just want to end with an epilogue before I finally wrap and hand over to questions, if anyone's still got any energy for questions. We used to say, well, what about B2B? What about B2B? I've talked exclusively about B2C, and we've never, in our data, been able to date to talk about B2B. So I don't know if there's anyone in here with an interest in B2B. If there is, then you've got one chart in your honour. You're lucky. Okay. So we're a bit tentative about this because we only have about 50 case studies. So these are tentative findings. But what we've done is, what we've asked is how many of these rules for growth can we validate in the B2B space? And there's a surprising number that we already can. So broadly speaking, the rules seem to hold, but particularly these 5. The relationship between share of voice and share growth is astonishingly similar to B2C. So advertising works in B2B just as it does in B2C. Brand building also works harder than activation in B2B. We see quite clear extra power from that. The optimum mix is not 60-40. Activation is clearly harder in B2B because there are other decision makers. It's usually a multi-stage process and so on and so forth. So the optimum mix is probably something like 45-55, but you'd kind of expect that. Broad targeting and the pursuit of mental availability absolutely drive growth in B2B as they do in B2C. No difference there. And then lastly, and perhaps most surprisingly to a lot of people who work in B2B, emotional strategies work hardest. Though, of course, it has to be said that an emotional strategy in B2B will look quite different from an emotional strategy in B2C. We'll be playing on the emotional state and desires and needs of people in the business world. And in the report that will be published by LinkedIn at some point when their art directors have finished tarting it up later this year, there will be a report that goes into all of this. So anyway, look, I'm going to wrap. I'm not going to reprise all of these. Those are the 7 rules of long-term effectiveness. Very, very happy to take any questions or challenges. There may well be people in here from digital marketing who hate everything I've had to say. I'm very, very happy if you want to get your anger in right now. Now is your chance. So thanks very much.
So do we have any questions for Peter before we close?
I've tried to leave not enough time in case there are any awkward questions. But
no? Really, that's concise and succinct. Right, well, on that notice, I think we'll wrap up. Peter opened with a challenge that if people didn't believe him at the end or weren't convinced, they could throw things at him. I haven't seen anything flying around, so Peter, I think you've done your job.
The night is yet young.
It is yet young. That's a whole other story. So look, I just wanted to say in closing, firstly, thank you everybody for coming. It's much appreciated. As I said in opening, I think Peter's story is part of a compelling and growing body of evidence about the need to focus on the long term and the short term and creativity and build brands long term to build emotional connection with consumers. And if we take that away as a message and take that back into our businesses, I think, in 12 months or 18 months' time, we'll all be in a better place. So finally, Peter, I'd just like to say thank you to you. It's great to have you here again. Thank you for coming all of this way. I know that people have found what you've been talking about challenging and stimulating, and as I say, hopefully they'll take it away and do something with it. So thank you for coming. Thank you for the book. The book is available online, comscouncil.nz. It's a free download, so make hay with it. Again, Peter, thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your stay. For those of you who don't know, when Peter leaves New Zealand, he's off for 5 weeks in Tahiti. So I hope you have a wonderful time there as well. So again, Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you. My secret.